Gargantuars were the ultimate enemy in Plants vs Zombies 1. After a full game of instas being entirely broken, they are the only enemy able to resist at least one, appearing in the last world, with an extremely dangerous imp-throw ability that lands in deep and creates a more unique zombie than just a big dumb brute. It only shows up in 2 levels in the main game, and then in survivals. And call them like you see them, I guess. It doesn't exist super often, but is incredibly threatening when it does. Meanwhile in PVZ2, they are as common as pond water, and rarely feel like they can do much of anything. Sure, they are sometimes extremely threatening in occasional levels, but more often than not they show up once well into an easy level, where you can just throw the anti-garg button you just casually bring around, because those plants are the best ones. I really don't like Gargantuars in PVZ2, and I think there's a few interesting reasons as to why. They really just don't feel all too significant here, at least for someone like me, and I want to emphasize this is more of a personal issue than anything, but I think it's interesting to cover, so I shall. I feel like this is becoming a theme with like half my videos. I won't have it any other way. But first, we have to pad runtime. What are Gargantuars? What do they do? Why do they exist? And then we can get into the real meat and potatoes of this video. But to be fair, there's a few more odd things I will cover here, because Gargantuars are inherently pretty interesting. Gargantuars are the biggest zombie in PVZ2. They are even bigger than some of the zombots, though it's not really super relevant. They aren't really based on anything in particular, but fit the ogre archetype. You know, the big dude that every fictional army has. Whether a mech, just a big guy, a tank, or whatever, the Gargantuar fits the bill. His name also literally is just Gargantuan, but with an R at the end, which is pretty funny, but also not really relevant. It just shows how the size is the point. There's also a reoccurring theme that he really wants a girlfriend for some reason. PVZ lore. Anyways, I want to start by talking about the insta-resistance thing. Gargantuars can take 2, but that's not really an ability they have. It's just a way to show the extreme health they carry, as it caps out at a massive 3,600, which is actually a buff from PVZ1, where they only have 3,000. They also received another key buff, where they are much faster. There isn't much of a reason for this, but it seems a fairly random change. I can actually take a guess why, but we'll get to it later. However, there has been a huge mechanical change that is crucial to understand. The imp-throw is much weaker in PVZ2. In PVZ1, the imp-throw has a lot more variety in where it lands, landing a few tiles ahead of the Gargantuar, and can be placed on a few different tiles as a result, usually around column 2 to column 4, depending on how quickly you can kill Gargantuars. In PVZ2, they will always throw the imp to column 3, nowhere else. In addition, the imps will delay eating for a brief moment as they land in PVZ2. It doesn't sound major, but it means that the imp throw can be negated quite simply. While in PVZ1, the imp throw is so dangerous that it changes where comp cannons are placed in Endless, which I consider a big deal. Anyway, Gargantuars also have a big stick, and they want to bash you over the head with it, real hard. I would probably do the same in truth if I had a big stick. Hashtag relatable. This means that Gargantuars don't really eat anything, they smash it, instantly killing every plant. In Plants vs Zombies 1, there is an exception to Spike Rock, which can take 9 hits for some reason. In Plants vs Zombies 2, there are a few more. Spike Rock and Primal Walnut both do this, but only take 3 each. There's a few other options occasionally. Plants like Instas will pretty much always survive a Garg Smash, but they usually don't last any real amount of time. Good for stall, admittedly. In Plants vs Zombies 1, I don't think they get smashed quick enough for this to matter, as it's super slow back then. This allows them to instantly remove walls. It also allows them to be slowed down by spamming weaker plants in front of them, which I'll bring up more later. The only thing left to note is that in PVZ2, there are Gargantuars in every world, and a few of these have unique abilities. Not too many, just a few. I want to cover these differences now, because a few are radically different and they should be addressed first. Gargantua Prime isn't really a Gargantua, ironically enough. It was made before Gargantuars were a thing, and is clearly a zombie in its own right. serving similarly to a Gargantuar, but with a big laser beam. Evidently, it's the coolest second thing ever, but they aren't super relevant to this video. They are just far too different. Slothgog is a little less different, firing 3 sloth imps instead of just 1. This isn't really all too unique, and isn't enough to shake it up, so I do consider it more or less the same. Jurrassic Marsh is Garg too, as it's tankier in a world all about things having a lot of HP, and is slightly slower to compensate. Works better for Jurrassic Marsh for sure, but just isn't enough to change it up. Handheld Garg is super different, but is fairly problematic for obvious reasons, I presume, which I don't really want to cover in this video. Right, now I want to briefly touch on the Penny's Pursuit and Arena Gargantuars, as a lot of these are actually quite different. Roman Garg's imp comes with a net that stuns a planet lands on, with 1800 extra HP for the Garg himself. The Z-Corps have varied HP values between the Gargantuar and the imp, with a lot of unique mechanics due to this, and the Strongman Garg flings some twins at you. Long story short, these guys are mostly unique and I won't be talking about much earlier. They still suffer from some overall issues, but they don't act as big a problem than the others, as there was an attempt. Now, with that said, I want to get the actual video going. So, I don't like Gargantuars, and here's why. It's important to note that Gargantuars were not part of PVZ2 when it first released. In fact, they were only added when the game got a huge rework early on. This is evidenced too by how the Gargantuars are used in the first 3 worlds, where they only exist as part of a singular level in each world, dedicated towards them. However, in later worlds this isn't the case at all, except for Age of 23, but for the record here, this level used to be an entirely unrelated minigame. Though this is relevant because this changes how Gargantuars fundamentally work as a threat. If they were only exclusive to the levels dedicated to them, they could have been a neat mini-boss. This is simply not the case. In later worlds, such as Big Wave Beach and Mixtape Tour, Gargantuars appear constantly. This includes before the dedicated Gargantuar level, for the record. This consistency is an issue, because it consistently devalues the threat of a Gargantuar. In Plant vs Zombies 1, Gargantuars were excessively rare, and a huge, massive threat when they were seen in a level. In PVZ2, they just sorta exist in a ton of levels, and you quickly get used to them. It doesn't help that each world progresses with Gargantuars the same way too. Even if these Gargantuars are used more sparingly, they are used in every single world, and reintroduced every single world. It doesn't matter anymore when or whether Gargantuars show up. You fight Gargantuars by the end of the first world, in a normal level no less. Gargantuars now thoroughly lack the build-up they require, now existing for approximately 95% of the entire game. You are forced to beat every world in a row now, after all, there is no way to escape them. You'll be fighting them constantly and frequently throughout the rest of the game. It doesn't help that these are the biggest threats. See, this is why this is an actual issue. Gargantuars aren't just these random enemies necessary for the game to work, like the basic trio. As a reminder, PVZ2 was made without these zombies in mind, and they were only added later in 1.7. Gargantuars were not necessary in the earlier worlds. There are a few important uses of them in later worlds for sure, but that's not my point here. They became important because the game were going to use them anyways, so they became core parts of the worlds. Notice, for instance, how a lot of later worlds lacked high HP zombies once Gargantuars became a big thing. Big Wave Beach, Mixtape Tour, and Lost City come to mind particularly. In other words, there was an alternative to making unique and interesting high HP threats to act as tanks, but instead we just get these big dumb brutes. It doesn't help either that Gargantuars aren't exactly all that hard to deal with once you get over that initial push to learn. If you're familiar with strategy games in general, you might be aware of the fairly common big super strong unit. You know what I mean, the super big cool unit that is the big flashy thing put there to attract new players, but an experienced player will find it much weaker than other options, often due to a mixture of high cost and unusable strength. Now, consider these units, then look at Gargantuars. They are basically the same thing, just now you're fighting it instead of potentially being able to use it. Gargantuars seem super scary, but truth be told, PVZ2's plans are just far too strong. It's not all that difficult to just spam out 2 damaging instant plans that you are already running for other zombies. And even worse, the stallers are far stronger than they were before, allowing you to reliably stall single targets in particular incredibly well. Think Primal Pea Shooter, or other things such as Stunion or Iceberg. These plans have a really bad habit of completely shutting down big dumb brutes such as Gargantuars, indirectly or not, and are far too strong in a one-on-one fight against them. This results in Gargantuars being super easy to deal with once you get them figured out. It doesn't help that, often, just flinging weaker plants at them can keep them in place. When plants like Puffshroom can be used everywhere, and plants like Sunflower are relatively so much more affordable than in PVZ1, it's extremely similar to just fling back Gargantuars and solve every issue. This wouldn't be a problem, but Gargantuars have a bad habit of causing levels to drag out for this. As far as late game threats go, Gargantuars aren't really a major one, but often serve as the only one. They can make other threats more dangerous for sure, but that's about as far as it will go. As soon as you learn how they work, they become little more than cannon fodder. And as the rest of the world later on tend to rely on Gargantuars a lot more, and you're fighting against them for most of the game up until they become the main threats being relied on, needless to say, I don't find them particularly fun to fight. Now, I want to admit something that, which may seem pretty obvious, is pretty darn important to keep in mind. I've played a lot more PVZ2 than most people watching. I'm not the most experienced, god no, but I have played enough to have this issue exaggerated a whole lot. I'm very used to fighting Gargantuars now, and a large part of my issues with them come from fighting them over and over in various mods. I want to specifically call out Eclise here, which is fairly infamous for using them excessively in all versions of the mod. It's a necessary evil, if anything, considering Eclise's high usage of super heavy plants, and to give you a real reason to use them, but it absolutely ruins your perception of a zombie when you get used to it. But I don't think this means that these issues are non-existent. Gargantuars would be less interesting than a more unique individual threat for each world. Think, for instance, Gargantua Prime. He sure shares some similarities with the Garg, but not only predates them, it seems implied he was planned before the rest of the Gargs appeared, due to the state of our feature in general, but has a very different role to the others, having a laser beam, giving it a more late game vibe. Ignoring the fact other Gargantuars exist, similarly unique zombies to pose as the late game major threats would have gone a good way to keep these worlds interesting for longer, as right now quite a few suffer from repetition. Then again, they did try this, and the attempt was questionable. If you don't know, there is a zombie included inside the game's files that is entirely unused, known as Cleopatra. I wonder who that could be. Joking aside, this was zombies that had assets made, and is entirely functional, but is currently entirely scrapped. Presumably because they were incredibly weak, acting only as a weaker disco zombie. Presumably as a mini-boss, but simply just not relevant enough to really do all too much. Its full role is pretty unknown overall though, so most of this is just speculation. However, we do know it was part of a set of zombies known as hero zombies, so most likely it was intended as a replacement for the Gargantua boss levels, which in earlier versions were the only place they existed, or as a zomboss fight, as those also didn't exist back then. Anyways, I want to go comment on something interesting. Why, despite all this, a zombie like Gargantua is so necessary. Because let's be real with ourselves here, they are actually incredibly important for a few specific reasons. So, let's get that covered, eh? When PVZ2 was created, back when Gargantuars didn't exist, there was another very important difference. The game used to be 25 sun meta, meaning that the game had a sun production style more similar to PVZ1, where a full sun is only equal to 25. This results in the game playing a lot slower, so it wasn't necessarily required to have a Gargantua. However, as the plants became significantly stronger due to some production change, it was necessary to add a more dangerous threat to pretty much every world. As the plants in PVZ2 are much stronger than the ones in PVZ1, it was necessary to even buff the Gargantua in the ways they did, with the improved speed and improved HP. It's important to note that in PVZ1 you simply don't have access to half the things you do in PVZ2, And as PVZ2 kept getting more plants, and, more importantly, less plants specifically meant to deal with 1 or 2 zombies, there is an inherent power creep. You get access to a lot more instant damage, and again, even more stallers. With these in mind, it's clearly crucial that a strong threat must counteract this absurdity. Thus, Gargantuars are used. Without them, it's relevant to note that it would be impossible for half the game to work. It would be impossible to keep the late game relevant, as Gargantuars themselves are the only thing that matters and can still be easily dealt with, if you can manage instances well enough. It wouldn't be all too hard if no super heavy threat existed, and I can very clearly see the value of Gargantuars in general. Trust me, without Gargantuars, PVZ2 would be a lot more boring. I want to bring this up to make one thing clear. What I want is not for Gargantuars to be removed. What I want is Gargantuars to be replaced with an equally late game set of units. Which obviously won't happen, considering the game is 10 years old, but still, I can dream. Also, I'm just gonna slap some things on at the end here. This wouldn't be nearly as much of an issue if the Gargantuars were suitably different. Hair Metal and Prime are the only two which force you to change your answers to them. And even then, the answer is usually just killing them quicker. It's an absolute shame and something I don't really like. In comparison, Slothgarg just fires 3 imps. 3 imps usually aren't enough to be a huge issue if your defense is built to deal with them, especially late game. It's not as if these stack up often at all. Jurassic's Gargantuar just works the exact same way as every other zombie in the world. It doesn't do anything all too unique. And to slap something else on to slap at the end, this is entirely ignoring the entire mechanic of plant food, which is a huge power creep on absolutely everything. Seriously, plant food itself might be the real issue for Gargantuars feeling less important, as it is so capable of clearing them out so easily, which is very much worth remembering. Overall, I want to emphasize the importance here that this is all opinionated, and realistically, Gargantuars are totally fine in most cases. The issue simply comes when you experience something too much, where cracks start to show. And I'm very aware of that. I just don't consider it enough to render these points irrelevant, as fundamentally, these issues always exist, just hidden behind other layers, I feel. Still, you are always allowed to disagree with me. At the end of the day, my opinion is about as valuable as your own, however easy to forget as that may be at times. I'm just a guy at the end of the day, which may be extremely forgettable as far as facts go, but it's true. Just because I say something and can show something resembling evidence, doesn't mean it's not fundamentally an opinion I have, more so than anything. Just something to keep in mind. Anyways, a brief note on the channel if you're interested in that. I'll be taking a week break soon to do some things on my own time, which means that the next video will take extra long to release. I guess also I should bring up I have a Discord you can join, as a lot of people don't realize it, and I keep forgetting to bring it up, so yeah. Either way, I have to go now. Gotta relax with an extreme passion. This has been Creeps, and have a good one.